2 million years ago, members of our human family faced brutally short lives that rarely reached beyond 12 years. Homo habilis, one of our earliest ancestors, endured possibly the worst time to have ever been human, facing a daily gauntlet of vicious predators, starvation, and deadly competition. Their small bodies, primitive tools, and dangerous diet forced them into a constant battle for survival. If you fall asleep to these, hit subscribe. Also, comment where you're listening from. Got people from New York to Berlin last time. Kinda cool thinking we're all drifting off together. We modern humans have it remarkably easy compared to our ancient relatives, and this is something we should be eternally grateful for. We humans, members of the genus Homo, have come remarkably far in the 2.8 million years of our existence. A lot of progress has especially been made within the last 200 years, and today we enjoy unprecedented levels of technology that has helped the worldwide lifespan reach roughly 73 years at birth. However, the journey to get here has not been an easy one, and we've had to endure many hardships, sometimes caused by our own doing. This is reflected by the shockingly low lifespans seen across time. In 18th century France, for example, the average lifespan was between 27 and 30 years old. In classical Greece it was 25, in the Bronze Age 26, and during the Neolithic period it got as low as 20. Yet even these historical hardships pale in comparison to what our earliest human ancestors endured. While Homo sapiens or modern humans have had it relatively easy compared to other human species, life as an early human was sometimes downright brutal. It's not uncommon for paleontologists to unearth an early human specimen who died under very grisly circumstances. Based on research, it seems that many Homo species suffered such lives, but one study in particular found that a certain group had it almost comically bad. The 2-million-year-old Homo habilis died so often so young that the majority of individuals didn't even live long enough to see their teen years. Their average lifespan has been estimated at about just 12 years old, more than 6 times less than our current average. What's crazy is that chances are it was even lower, as the study looked at 26 random specimens and noted a lack of neonate and infantile individuals. This heavily suggests that the mortality rate was in reality much higher, and thus the life expectancy even lower than 12 years old. Such a fast and short life makes Homo habilis the last human species you'd want to wake up as. It represents possibly the worst time to have ever been a human overall, which thus begs the question, why were their lives so utterly brutal? Unfortunately for them, the answer is that virtually everything was stacked against them, including their very own bodies. Homo habilis was one of the smallest humans to have ever lived, possibly averaging under 4 feet or 1.2 meters in height. This made them 32% shorter than ourselves, and in the best case weighing just 60% of what we do. Such a small body obviously made them quite vulnerable to injuries. To add fuel to the fire, they didn't even have any notable robustness to their skeletal structure that would have at least helped them compensate for their lack of size. It's likely that they experienced at least one serious fall throughout their life because they're partially arboreal, meaning they spent a good chunk of their lives in trees. Given that chimps often experience at least one major fall throughout their lives, the same can reasonably be said for Homo habilis. This is especially true since they weren't as well adapted for climbing compared to chimpanzees. Although relative to other humans, they were more ape-like overall, a result of them having been one of the first of our kind to enter the scene, with an existence that spanned from 2.3 to 1.65 million years ago. Some of these ape-like features included longer limbs and slightly apish extremities. These adaptations allowed them to better grip while climbing and swing from branch to branch. Now, possessing the ability to climb with ease is of course very useful, especially when surrounded by predators. In most cases, it lets animals easily avoid danger, therefore prolonging their life. However, in the case of the Habilis, the benefits of this ability were largely negated as it was paired with the worst possible diet: carnivorism. You might think that a human living on a planet would be strictly vegetarian, but the Habilis actually exhibited one of the higher levels of meat-eating seen in humans. This is reflected by their very large incisors that helped them cut through meat. Their proportionally giant mandibles were thicker than those of any living ape or human. This allowed them to generate more torsion and stress while biting and thus helping to rip meat off of a body. This being said, they did also eat a lot of fruit and vegetables, but their meat-rich diet ultimately forced them to leave the safety of trees routinely. This problem was exacerbated by their fondness for fish, which brought them close to water and thus the dangers within. And it wasn't just meat that was the problem, but also how they got it. For some reason, Homo habilis decided to specialize in scavenging of all things, which is almost funny considering their small size, lack of large muscles, and limited technology that consisted of simple stone tools. In other words, they did not have much to help them secure kills. One group of paleontologists found that at best they would only be able to reliably defend carcasses from jackals and cheetahs. This meant basically nothing, though, as Homo habilis, who lived in eastern South Africa, was surrounded by not one but multiple large carnivores that would frequently show up to contest carrion. To make matters worse, these same predators also routinely preyed on the Habilis themselves, as these early humans were, for lack of a better term, easy pickings. So, if you were a Homo habilis, you can be sure that on the daily you lived under the constant threat of being picked off by a very diverse range of different carnivores. Mind you, each had their own unique, terrible way to dispatch you, so I guess at least there's some variety. For now, direct evidence of interactions between predators and Habilis are quite rare, but when looking at time and general vicinity, over 30 potential predators have been identified. Large cats in particular had a profound impact on destroying their lifespans. One of the most prevalent ones lurking around would have been the Meganterion, a jaguar-sized, saber-toothed cat that lived throughout Africa for the entire span of the Habilis' existence. Despite being jaguar-shaped, it was more heavily built and alarmingly had lower limbs that were actually lion-sized. These limbs possessed giant paws at the ends of them, where razor-sharp, recurved claws sat, just waiting to dig into the flesh of any unsuspecting Homo habilis. Once pinned, the Habilis would then get to experience an array of sharp and serrated teeth, including 2 enlarged canines that would sink into their throat, severing major arteries and nerves. This fortunately led to unconsciousness within seconds. However, unfortunately, there's also the chance that an unlucky victim would have had to experience the more rare but much more terrifying killing method of having its entire head virtually covered by the attacking saber-tooth cat. Miraculously, this actually happened to a known human specimen who had puncture marks to its occipital bone, in other words, the back of its head. But what's crazy is that the angle of the bite confirmed that the attack did not come from the back, but rather the front. This basically means the Meganterion put the entire human's head in its mouth. The idea is that on top of causing skull and brain damage, such an attack could kill by completely smothering the victim's nose and mouth with the saber-tooth's jaw, leading to suffocation. In a case of more bad news for our distant relatives, the Meganterion had a very healthy appetite for Homo habilis, so much so in fact that it literally altered their carbon isotopic levels. This directly shows us that it was even more of a human killer than other animals that are associated with hunting primitive humans. One such alternative predator was the Felis, which I should also mention coexisted with Homo habilis and presumably hunted it as well. To add fuel to the fire, there was also Homo and Machairodus lurking around too. This was very unfortunate, as the latter happened to be one of the largest felids to have ever existed, with some species reaching 405 kilograms or 893 pounds. That's comparable to both a Smilodon and male polar bears. At this size, it's not hard to imagine that even a well-placed paw swipe could take out an individual, especially since many victims seem to be targeted while young. Avoiding death by Machairodus would have been surprisingly difficult because despite its great size, the Machairodus was a better jumper than many of the smaller, more agile cats. Its legs were too short to pursue long chases, which indicates that it relied on powerful jumps in order to catch prey, all to say that escape by climbing a tree was pretty much out of the question. Meanwhile, while smaller, the Homotherium still stuck out as a notoriously bad animal for Habilis to get caught by. Its canines and incisors were shortened but broader than what's seen in other saber-toothed cats, transforming them into powerful puncturing weapons. These teeth also benefited from crenulations, in other words, irregular serration that were wavy, creating a one-of-a-kind bite that both sliced and punctured simultaneously. While these cats were definitely a menace to Habilis society, they were not the only group notorious for shortening their lives. Another family of predators that loved to snack on our ancestors were hyenas. Like the cats, there were also multiple different hyenas that went after hominins, but there were two that really stuck out, the Chasmoporthetes and Perchicracuta. In typical unlucky Habilis fashion, the Perchicracuta happened to be one of the largest hyenas of all time, with specimens not only averaging the size of a lioness, but also possessing a bone-crushing bite. This bite is likely one of the strongest pound-for-pound bites of any terrestrial mammal. This unusually powerful bite was also problematic, not just because it would absolutely destroy you, but also because the ability to crack bones meant easy access to bone marrow. Thus, it's likely that Pachicracuta showed up to a lot of carcasses, not a great thing for our scavenging ancestor. Then when you add in the fact that Pachicracuta likely hunted in packs, you suddenly have a whole serving and a half of death, and if caught, you'd also have to worry about the fact that in many situations, hyenas will literally eat their prey alive, which is something that I, at least personally, would want to avoid. This problem would have actually been worse with the Chasmoporthetes, a smaller, yet in some ways scarier kind of hyena. This was a member of an informal group of hyenas who are touted as being dog-like, meaning they are more gracile and nimble, likely prowling around in large packs. This more fragile size might sound like good news, but it really isn't. A small but giant pack of dog-like hyenas eating you is definitely vastly more painful than getting one and doned by a giant one. But the real issue wasn't this aspect of the Chasmoporthetes, but rather its limb construction, which reflected adaptations designed for extreme speed. It bears a strong resemblance to the legs seen in cheetahs, and thus led to it being nicknamed the running or hunting hyena. The major problem with this is that Homo habilis, on the other hand, was not a very good runner, and at best could achieve a certain degree of endurance running. To add to their misery, these hyenas were also hypercarnivores, meaning that over 70% of their calories came from meat alone. They enacted this diet through their razor-sharp teeth that strangely had edges shaped like those of a big cat, but as bad as these guys sound, they were nothing compared to what lurked in the waters of the Homo habilis environment, giant crocs. In other words, a nightmare for our ancestors, considering that, as mentioned, they had a fondness for fishing, and not with a fishing rod or spear, but rather with their hands, which almost makes it seem like they wanted to be hunted down by crocodiles. Let's just say these crocs were more than happy to oblige. The most notable kinds back then happen to have belonged to the same genus of crocodile alive today, the Crocodilus. That being said, you would not have to worry about confusing them for any living species, as these ones were utterly giant, the two largest having been the Crocodilus thorbjarnasoni and the Crocodilus anthropophagus. Now you may be wondering about the anthrop part of the latter's name. And the reason for it is because this croc loved to eat people. This led to a name which literally means human eater. Of course, as such, we have direct evidence for its human diet, as in one formation alone, 2 juvenile habilis were found with severe damage to their legs and feet that match the teeth of this crocodile. This showcases how they would seemingly target the legs while springing ambushes and then proceed to kill their prey by either drowning them or using a death roll to literally rip their limbs off. Apparently, this happened in both of these 2 cases. In other words, not a pleasant way to go out, and fighting back was not an option, as Anthropophagus was covered in very sturdy armour and was even larger than your normal saltwater crocodile. Adults reached a length of 7.5 metres or 25 feet and weighed around 1.5 tons. To just put that into perspective, the longest recorded extent croc, an individual named Lolong, only reached 20 feet or 6 metres and weighed just 1.1 tons. So as you can imagine, at this gargantuan size, Anthropophagus surely had 1 killer bite, which along with its human diet makes it come off as one pretty devilish creature. That's why it's perfectly fitting that it also possessed 2 prominent ridges or horns above its eyes that made it not just lethal, but also visually terrifying. However, while it seems to have definitely been the most problematic croc for humans, it wasn't actually the largest. That title went to the thorbjarnasoni, a slightly older crocodile that also coexisted with the habilis and preyed on them during the earlier days of our ancestors' existence. Thankfully, it wasn't that much bigger than its younger counterpart, having been about 8 metres or 26.2 feet long. But it's not that much of an upside, as that of course still makes it the largest Crocodilus species ever discovered, which in turn also makes it one of the biggest true crocodiles to have ever lived. Because its remains are so few and far between, there's a very good chance that it got even bigger. What was really unique about this predator, though, was its skull. In addition to being gargantuan, it was also much broader than what's seen in other living crocodiles. This was perhaps an adaptation to help better grip and crush armoured prey such as large turtles. Despite the specialisation, it was still likely an opportunistic feeder who no doubt fed on the occasional hominin. In fact, the holotype for Homo habilis, a specimen dubbed OH7, may have been a victim itself. Its foot and leg bones bore large, broad and deep puncture wounds that match the teeth of a giant croc. Like the other fellows I mentioned earlier, it seems that OH7 lost its limb in this violent attack and also lost its life. But what's crazy is that things for this specimen were even more unfair than just this. A certain group of researchers believe that it wasn't just attacked by a croc, but a mammalian carnivore as well. While analysing the upper body, paleontologists noticed that on its parietal bone, the holotype had shallow groove marks that did not match any bite seen in crocodiles. Rather, the damage bore an uncanny resemblance to the bite of large cats. This led to the idea that a leopard-sized mammal had taken a chunk out of OH7's head, ouch to say the least, although it's not known for certain if this attack had been carried out after the specimen had already died, or if this had been an earlier attack that it managed to survive. While this question remains, it's clear that these guys had many predators to watch out for, and of course prehistoric cats, hyenas and giant crocs were just the tip of the iceberg, as you also had many predators around that are still alive today. These included various panthera, canids, birds of prey and snakes. Snakes especially were likely another major component in explaining Homo habilis' short lifespan. Despite no direct evidence of attacks being known of, we do know that in general, snakes and hominids have a dicey relationship at best. To this day, snakes cause tens of thousands of deaths within Africa alone, with venomous snakes being the worst perpetrators. In uncontacted tribes, attacks by constricting snakes remain the highest source of mortality for specific groups. Some scientists believe that snakes were so problematic for early man that they essentially created an evolutionary arms race between the two. Enhanced visual detection possibly being an adaptation designed to better help us detect camouflaged snakes. Not to mention that primates in general may be literally hardwired to fear snakes, at least according to a few studies. So in other words, it's pretty much guaranteed that Homo habilis were also victims of serpents. Now, the amount of predators that the habilis' diet forced them to confront was no doubt a travesty for them. Yet it wasn't just predators that ascending the trees brought them into contact with. Many territorial herbivores and omnivores were also found in great numbers and included a variety of prehistoric rhinos, hippos, giant warthogs, elephant-like species, giraffes, and bovids. Needless to say, these animals did not kill humans as often as predators, but deaths still happened. Despite being lesser in numbers and diversity, herbivores and omnivores in present-day Africa cause a few thousand deaths per year across the board. If forcing them to confront vicious animals wasn't enough, then it's a good thing that their diet's drawbacks went even further than this. It possibly also led to health problems, namely to the teeth. Of the 26 individuals studied, only about 40% had decent teeth, while the rest had severe wear and tear to their enamels and chipped and cracked teeth. While this may not sound all that gloomy, it really is when you consider that the oldest specimen was only 25 years old. There were even multiple examples of specimens who were under 10 that already had major dental problems. To really exemplify this, one individual who was 17 years old was found with dentistry so poor that it was about 2 times as bad as what you would expect to see in a modern elderly human who also had bad dental hygiene. This remarkable widespread level of damage was 100% caused by the diet of Homo habilis, but it was not necessarily a result of the scavenged meat. It could have been instead a combination of flesh, bone, and tough plant material that caused a lot of wear and tear. Plus, given their lack of offence, the habilis likely did not get the first pick when it came to food. This would have resulted in them having a limited choice and forcing individuals to eat whatever was available, even if it was no good for their dental hygiene. Another factor in this lack of choice, which in itself likely also contributed to even more deaths, was their environment and climate. During the Pliocene, Africa experienced a period of intense fluctuations in the climate that resulted in coldness and increased aridity that made food options very scarce. This even led to systematic starvation, and it's believed that as the climate worsened, populations had to rely more and more on scavenging meat to supplement their caloric intake. This in turn led to, again, more deaths as it brought them into contact with more predators, who also would have been more violent as they too felt the strains of a dying ecosystem. Interestingly, but perhaps not that surprising, the competition that was created from these climatic changes may have also led the Habilis to experience more fatalities at the hands of an animal it was very close to itself. And I don't actually mean other Habilis, although this was definitely a possibility, but rather other humans. Habilis remains have been found in the same area as not just one, but 3 other Homo species, as well as another hominin, these specifically being Homo rudolfensis, Homo erectus, and Homo ergaster, and the Paranthropus boisei, respectively. We are aware that interactions with these close relatives at least sometimes ended violently. There is at least one known Paranthropus specimen who was definitely killed by Habilis, possibly even becoming food for it. Now, in this particular instance, the Habilis managed to secure the dub, yet with the other Homo species, it was likely at a severe disadvantage for a few reasons. Firstly, it was the smallest Homo species of the time and the least adapted for a terrestrial life. So any confrontation on the ground would have been the home field for the others. Secondly, the Habilis unfortunately had the second smallest brain seen in any human, with an average brain size of between 500 and 687 cubic centimeters. That made it 25% smaller than the next smallest-brained Homo species it coexisted with, the Rudolfensis. Meanwhile, the erectus could sometimes have a brain literally double the size. This large difference likely led to an intelligence gap between the Habilis and its competitors, a notion partially reflected by the varying technologies that each species achieved. For example, the erectus had access to controlled fires, picks, knives, and cleavers, which would have given them a huge edge during any fight, to say the least. To make matters worse, despite not being a hominin, I will also mention that the ape Deinopithecus was likely a part of the fray as well. In some ways, this creature was even more unsettling than multiple Homo species. It was a giant primate that was closely related to baboons and thus had giant fangs and would have been roped with large amounts of muscles. When considering the fact that it could have been 3 times the size of Homo habilis, we should probably add this guy to the already very long list of potential predators. Ultimately, it was a very tough and unfair world to the Homo habilis, and according to the original study, the worst part of an individual's life would have started at around age 10. That's when they entered a phase associated with maximum mortality, though ironically, reaching 10 in the first place would have already made you one of the luckier ones. Based on another study, it's presumed that 40% of everyone died before reaching double digits. And if we factor in juveniles and infants, then it's believed that this number increases to 60%. This in turn would mean that the average age of death given in the study would actually be lower than 12 years, which then of course raises a whole other question. How in the world did the habilis even manage to exist for such a long time? Perhaps the answer lies in their technology that did in fact allow them to access bone marrow and tough plant material. Additionally, there is an offhand chance that a 1.7 million year old windbreak or rough hut was built by a group of Homo habilis. If a fact, this implies that they had a way to deal with the worsening climate of their times. The numbers game also seems to have played a big part in their miraculous extended survival, as paleontologists estimate that group sizes may have reached up to 85 different members, thus allowing for more protection and a lower chance that any given individual would have been picked off by a carnivore. Though honestly, based on everything, that didn't seem to work out too great for them. Who knows, perhaps the extremely high mortality rate was what finally broke them. But whatever the case, one thing is clear, being a Homo habilis sucked. Now, despite our focus on this particularly unlucky early human species, it's worth noting that life wasn't much better for most of our other ancestors either. The entire path of human evolution has been strewn with species that faced their own unique challenges and dangers. Take Homo erectus, for instance, a species that followed the Habilis. While they had larger brains and better technology, they still faced many of the same predators and climate challenges as their predecessors. However, their physical adaptations and improved tools did give them a significant advantage. Standing taller at about 5 foot 9 inches for males, they had longer legs adapted for running rather than climbing. This helped them escape predators more effectively and travel longer distances in search of food and water. With a brain size ranging from 800 to 1,100 cubic centimeters, they were considerably more intelligent than Habilis. This increased intelligence allowed them to create more sophisticated tools, including hand axes and cleavers that were useful both for processing food and for defense. Perhaps most importantly, there's strong evidence that Homo erectus had mastered the use of fire. Fire provided warmth in cold climates, protection from predators, and the ability to cook food, which increases digestibility and caloric intake. These advantages helped erectus become the most successful and long-lived human species to date, persisting for nearly 2 million years. Yet, despite these advantages, erectus individuals still faced enormous challenges. They likely experienced frequent periods of food scarcity, particularly during drought events that became more common as the climate fluctuated. They remained vulnerable to predation, although to a lesser extent than Habilis. Injuries that would be relatively minor today often proved fatal due to infection, and competition with other hominin species, including other erectus groups, likely resulted in violent conflicts over resources. Another species worth considering is Homo heidelbergensis, which evolved around 700,000 years ago. This species was even more physically robust than erectus, with males standing around 6 feet tall and weighing around 100 pounds more than a modern human of the same height. Their large, thick bones suggest they led physically demanding lives, and injuries were common. Fossil specimens show evidence of healed fractures, suggesting that these individuals received some form of care from their group members. This suggests some level of compassion and social cooperation, a uniquely human trait that may have helped offset some of the brutal realities of prehistoric life. The intelligence of heidelbergensis was also significantly greater than that of earlier species. Their average brain size was similar to that of modern humans, and they created more complex tools than their predecessors. There's evidence they were skilled hunters who could take down large game, including horses and deer. They may have been the first hominin species to build simple shelters, construct wooden spears, and use complex communication systems. But despite these capabilities, life for heidelbergensis was still far shorter and more brutal than what we experience today. Disease, injury, conflict, and periodic food shortages took a heavy toll. The fossilized remains of heidelbergensis individuals often show signs of malnutrition, particularly during developmental years. Dental problems were rampant, with cavities, abscesses, and severe wear patterns suggesting both dietary stress and the use of teeth as tools. Moving forward in time to our even closer relatives, the Neanderthals, we see a species perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. Their stocky, powerful bodies conserved heat efficiently, with short limbs and barrel-shaped chests. Their large noses warmed and moistened cold air before it reached their lungs, and their brains were actually larger on average than those of modern humans, although structured differently. Neanderthals were sophisticated tool makers who created specialized implements for different tasks. They controlled fire, cooked their food, made clothing from animal hides, and even created simple forms of jewelry. Archaeological evidence suggests they buried their dead and may have had some form of spiritual beliefs. They cared for injured and elderly group members, sometimes for years, despite severe disabilities that would have prevented individuals from contributing to the group's survival. And yet, despite all these capabilities, Neanderthal life remained brutally hard by modern standards. Isotope studies of their bones show they were almost exclusively carnivorous, suggesting plant foods were scarce in their Ice Age environments. This reliance on hunting large, dangerous animals resulted in extremely high rates of traumatic injury. Nearly every adult Neanderthal skeleton shows evidence of at least one major fracture or wound, giving rise to what paleoanthropologists call the rodeo rider pattern of injury. Imagine living a life so physically demanding that your skeleton ends up looking like that of someone who repeatedly gets thrown from bulls for a living. That's basically what Neanderthal life did to your body. What's particularly interesting is that despite these injuries, many Neanderthals survived for years afterward, indicating they received long-term care from their group members. This suggests strong social bonds and a willingness to support injured individuals who couldn't hunt or gather for themselves. But this care came at a cost. In small groups struggling for survival in harsh Ice Age conditions, supporting injured members meant less food and resources for everyone else. The fact that they did it anyway speaks to something fundamentally human about Neanderthals. And what about our own species, Homo sapiens? Surely we had it better, right? Well, not exactly. Early modern humans faced many of the same challenges as other hominin species. For much of our existence, we lived as hunter-gatherers in small bands, vulnerable to predation, disease, injury, and starvation. One of the earliest Homo sapiens fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dating to around 300,000 years ago, shows signs of a hard life. The teeth are heavily worn, suggesting a rough diet that included abrasive foods. There are also signs of nutritional stress during development. Even as we spread across the globe, developing increasingly sophisticated tools and social structures, life remained brutally difficult by modern standards. The fossil record shows frequent evidence of violent deaths, with skulls bearing unmistakable signs of blunt force trauma. Some of the most remarkable evidence of violence comes from Nataruk in Kenya, where archaeologists discovered a 10,000-year-old massacre site. The remains of 27 individuals, including women and children, were found with evidence of extreme violence, including blunt force trauma to the head, projectile wounds, and even hands bound behind backs. This suggests that intergroup conflict has been a feature of human existence for a very long time. While Habilis had to worry primarily about predators and other hominin species, early Homo sapiens often had to worry about other Homo sapiens. As we developed agriculture around 12,000 years ago, many aspects of human life actually got worse before they got better. The transition to farming brought with it new diseases, less diverse diets leading to nutritional deficiencies, and social stratification that created new forms of human suffering. The skeletal remains of early farmers show they were often shorter and less robust than their hunter-gatherer predecessors, with more evidence of anemia, tooth decay, and vitamin deficiencies. Infectious diseases became more common as people lived in closer proximity to each other and to domesticated animals. The rise of cities and civilization brought new dangers. Epidemic diseases could now sweep through dense populations, killing thousands or even millions. Historical records are full of accounts of devastating plagues, from the Plague of Athens in 430 BCE to the Black Death in the 14th century. War became increasingly organized and lethal. The development of bronze and then iron weapons allowed humans to kill each other with greater efficiency. The rise of empires meant that conflicts could engulf entire regions, displacing and killing vast numbers of people. But despite all these hardships, the average lifespan of Homo sapiens throughout most of our history was still significantly longer than that of Homo habilis. Archaeological evidence suggests that in many hunter-gatherer societies, individuals who survived childhood could often live into their 60s or 70s. This was a far cry from the 12-year average lifespan of Habilis. So what made their situation so uniquely terrible compared to all other human species? The answer lies in the perfect storm of disadvantages they faced. First, there's the timing of their existence. Habilis emerged during a period of significant climate fluctuation when Africa was becoming drier and more open. They were caught in an evolutionary transition, still partially adapted for an arboreal lifestyle, but increasingly forced to venture onto dangerous open grasslands. Unlike later Homo species, they hadn't yet developed the full suite of adaptations for terrestrial living. They couldn't run fast or far. They lacked the height to spot predators at a distance. They didn't have the endurance for long-distance travel or pursuit hunting. Second, there's their place in the food chain. Habilis occupied what ecologists call a mesopredator niche. Similar to modern hyenas or jackals, they were both predator and prey, scavenging the kills of large carnivores while constantly at risk of becoming prey themselves. Later, human species gradually moved up the food chain, becoming apex predators in their own right. But Habilis never achieved this status. They remained vulnerable in a way that later hominins were not. Third, there's their technological limitations. While Habilis was the first known toolmaker, their Oldowan industry was extremely simple by later standards. These tools were little more than stone cobbles with flakes removed to create a sharp edge. They lacked the specialized tools that later species would develop for hunting, defense, and shelter construction. They had no projectile weapons to fend off predators from a safe distance. They hadn't mastered fire, which would later prove crucial for protection and cooking. Fourth, there's their social structure. While we know little for certain about Habilis' social organization, their small brain size suggests they lacked the cognitive capacity for the complex social bonds and communication that helped later human species survive. They likely lived in smaller groups than later hominins, making them more vulnerable to predation and less able to defend resources against competitors. Their communication was probably limited, hampering their ability to coordinate in dangerous situations. What's truly striking is that despite all these disadvantages, Habilis managed to survive as a species for over 500,000 years. This speaks to their adaptability and resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges. Recent excavations at Olduvai Gorge, where many Habilis fossils have been found, have revealed new insights into how they managed to survive. One key strategy appears to have been their ability to exploit a variety of food sources. Analysis of dental calculus, the mineralized plaque that forms on teeth, shows that Habilis consumed not just meat and fish, but also various plant foods, including tubers, berries, and possibly even some forms of fungi. This dietary flexibility would have been crucial during periods of scarcity. There's also evidence that Habilis was selectively choosing high-quality stone for their tools, sometimes carrying raw materials over several kilometers. This suggests a level of planning and foresight that, while limited compared to later species, would have provided a crucial edge. The fossil record also indicates that Habilis may have been more successful in some environments than others. They appear to have thrived near water sources where they could access aquatic resources like fish, turtles, and shellfish. These environments would have also attracted the large predators that Habilis scavenged from, creating a dangerous but potentially rewarding ecological niche. The proximity to water would have provided some protection as well, as Habilis could escape into shallow water where many predators would be reluctant to follow. But this specialization came at a cost. By tying themselves to specific environments, Habilis became vulnerable to climate change. As Africa experienced periods of increased aridity during the early Pleistocene, their preferred habitats would have shrunk, intensifying competition for resources. This likely contributed to their eventual extinction around 1.65 million years ago, as more adaptable species like Homo erectus expanded into their territory. The very specialization that allowed them to survive for so long ultimately proved to be their undoing. One of the most remarkable Habilis fossils, known as OH62, provides a poignant glimpse into the brutal reality of life for these early humans. Discovered in Olduvai Gorge in 1986, this partial skeleton belongs to a female who stood just 3 feet tall. Her tiny frame would have made her especially vulnerable to predation, and indeed her bones show evidence of a violent death. There are puncture marks consistent with a large carnivore attack, possibly from a leopard or similar-sized predator. What's particularly striking about OH62 is that she shows signs of having survived previous attacks or injuries. There are healed fractures on several bones, suggesting she had endured and recovered from serious trauma more than once before her death. This pattern of multiple injuries is common in Habilis fossils. O7, the type specimen for the species, shows evidence of not just the crocodile attack mentioned earlier, but also signs of blunt force trauma to the skull that had partially healed before death. Another specimen, O24, has a massive depressed fracture on the left side of the skull. The injury was so severe that it would have caused brain damage, yet the individual survived for some time afterward, as indicated by signs of healing around the wound. These fossils tell a story of lives filled with constant danger and frequent injury, yet they also speak to a remarkable toughness and resilience. Despite their physical disadvantages, Habilis individuals clearly fought hard to survive. The climate during the Habilis period adds another layer to their hardships. Around 2 million years ago, Earth was experiencing what geologists call the onset of Northern Hemisphere glaciation, a period when ice sheets began to form and expand across North America and Eurasia. While Africa wasn't directly affected by glaciation, these global climate changes had profound effects on regional weather patterns. East Africa, where Habilis lived, experienced increased climate variability, with rapid shifts between wet and dry periods. Lake cores from the region show evidence of these fluctuations, with layers of sediment indicating periods when lakes expanded and contracted dramatically over relatively short timeframes. These changes would have constantly reshaped the landscape Habilis relied on. During dry periods, water sources would have shrunk, concentrating both prey and predators around the remaining resources. This would have intensified competition and increased the risk of predation for Habilis. Wet periods brought their own challenges. Expanded lakes and rivers could cut off access to familiar territories, forcing groups to venture into unknown and potentially dangerous areas. Increased vegetation might provide more food, but also more cover for ambush predators. Recent paleoclimate research suggests that the period between 2 and 1.7 million years ago was characterized by particularly rapid climate oscillations. This means that Habilis populations would have had to adapt to new conditions within the span of a few generations, a significant challenge for a species with limited technological and cognitive resources. These climate fluctuations likely contributed to the extraordinary selective pressures that drove human evolution. In fact, some researchers argue that it was precisely these harsh and rapidly changing conditions that spurred the evolution of larger brains and more complex social structures in later Homo species. But for Habilis, caught at the beginning of this evolutionary trajectory, these conditions represented a brutal challenge. They lacked the adaptations that would later help their descendants thrive in variable environments. Archaeological evidence from Habilis sites provides further insights into their precarious existence. Oldowan tool assemblages are often found alongside animal bones bearing stone tool cut marks overlaid by carnivore tooth marks. This pattern suggests that Habilis was in direct competition with large carnivores for access to carcasses. The overlap of cut marks and tooth marks indicates that Habilis would sometimes lose these contests, forced to abandon their hard-won food to more powerful competitors. What's particularly interesting is the evidence for what researchers call active scavenging. Rather than passively collecting leftovers from predator kills, Habilis appears to have actively competed for access to fresh carcasses. This would have been incredibly dangerous, putting them in direct conflict with lions, hyenas, and other formidable predators. The fact that they engaged in this behavior suggests the potential rewards were worth the extreme risks, a testament to the harsh realities of their existence. The locations of Habilis sites also tell us something about their survival strategies. Many are found near what would have been the shores of ancient lakes or rivers, suggesting a strong reliance on these environments. These locations would have provided access to drinking water, of course, but also to various food resources. Stone tools found at these sites show evidence of having been used to process both animal and plant materials. The proximity to water bodies also created another surprising advantage: access to aquatic foods rich in brain-building nutrients. Analysis of carbon isotopes in Habilis fossils suggests they consumed significant amounts of fish, shellfish, and possibly other aquatic animals. These food sources are rich in docosahexaenoic acid, an omega-3 fatty acid crucial for brain development. Some researchers have suggested that this dietary shift may have played a role in the brain expansion that characterized human evolution. But again, this adaptation came with serious risks. As we've seen, the water's edge brought them into contact with crocodiles and other dangerous predators. The fossil record shows numerous examples of Habilis individuals who died violent deaths at these locations. Of particular interest is the KNM-ER 1813 specimen discovered at Kubifora in Kenya. This partial skeleton shows evidence of both crocodile predation and scavenging by other carnivores, a grim testament to the hazards of Habilis's preferred habitat. The fact that we find so many Habilis fossils showing evidence of predation is telling in itself. In the fossil record generally, predation victims are relatively rare. Most animals die from disease, starvation, or old age, with their remains scavenged afterward. The high frequency of predation marks on Habilis fossils suggests that being killed by predators was an unusually common fate for them, even compared to other prey species of the time. This brings us to another crucial aspect of Habilis life, their social structure and how it influenced their survival chances. While direct evidence is limited, we can make informed inferences based on their brain size, body proportions, and the distribution of their fossils. Habilis had a brain size ranging from around 500 to 700 cubic centimeters, roughly 3 to 4 times the size of a chimpanzee's brain, but only about half that of a modern human. This suggests cognitive abilities somewhere between those of great apes and later human species. They likely lived in small groups, perhaps 10 to 20 individuals, based on comparisons with both great apes and modern hunter-gatherer societies. These small group sizes would have limited their ability to defend against predators or compete with other hominin species. There's also evidence that Habilis exhibited significant sexual dimorphism, with males being considerably larger than females. This pattern is often associated with polygynous mating systems, where dominant males mate with multiple females. Such social structures can increase male-male competition and potentially lead to higher mortality rates among young adult males. They can also reduce overall genetic diversity, making populations more vulnerable to diseases and environmental changes. For female Habilis, life would have presented additional challenges. Pregnancy and childcare would have made them more vulnerable to predation, requiring additional protection from group members. The fossil record suggests that maternal mortality was extremely high. One particularly poignant example is the skeleton known as OH80, discovered in 2005. This female Habilis shows evidence of having died while pregnant or shortly after giving birth, based on distinctive markers in her pelvic bones. The combination of small body size, limited brain capacity for planning and problem solving, and the demands of pregnancy would have made female Habilis especially vulnerable. Yet without successful reproduction, the species would have quickly disappeared. This suggests that despite the enormous challenges, Habilis groups must have developed effective strategies for protecting pregnant females and young children. These might have included staying in trees when possible, maintaining vigilant lookouts, and potentially even rudimentary forms of cooperative childcare. The fact that Habilis managed to survive for over 500,000 years indicates that these strategies, whatever they were, proved remarkably effective despite the overwhelming odds against them. Another fascinating aspect of Habilis life was their cognitive abilities and limitations. With a brain roughly half the size of a modern human's, they would have lacked many of the mental capabilities we take for granted. Studies of brain evolution suggest that while Habilis had somewhat expanded frontal lobes compared to earlier hominins, they still lacked the full development of areas associated with complex language, long-term planning, and abstract thought. This cognitive limitation would have affected every aspect of their lives. They likely couldn't communicate about past or future events in detail. They probably couldn't plan complex hunting strategies. Their ability to innovate new tools or techniques would have been limited. Yet within these constraints, they demonstrated remarkable adaptability. The Oldowan tool industry, while simple by later standards, represented a significant cognitive leap beyond what any other animal was capable of at the time. The process of selecting appropriate stones, determining the right angles for striking, and applying controlled force to create usable flakes requires a level of spatial reasoning and cause-effect understanding that exceeds that of even our closest primate relatives. Recent experimental archaeology has demonstrated just how difficult Oldowan tool-making is. Modern humans with no prior experience struggle to produce effective tools even with instruction. The fact that Habilis mastered this skill with their limited cognitive resources is impressive. Some researchers have suggested that tool-making itself may have driven brain evolution in early humans. The complex motor skills and planning required might have created selective pressure for expanded neural circuitry, particularly in areas related to hand-eye coordination and sequential planning. If this hypothesis is correct, then Habilis represents a crucial transitional stage in human cognitive evolution, caught between the more limited abilities of earlier hominins and the more advanced capabilities of later Homo species. This cognitive in-between status would have created unique challenges. Habilis may have been just smart enough to recognize dangers and opportunities that earlier hominins couldn't perceive, but not quite smart enough to fully address them. Imagine being able to recognize that a saber-toothed cat was likely to attack at dawn, but lacking the cognitive ability to plan a coordinated defense or fashion more effective weapons. This partial awareness without full problem-solving capability might have created a uniquely stressful existence. The development of fear and anxiety responses in human evolution is an interesting related topic. These emotional responses evolved as protective mechanisms, allowing our ancestors to anticipate and avoid dangers. But in Habilis, with their limited frontal lobe development for emotional regulation, these responses might have been particularly intense and difficult to manage. Without the cognitive tools to contextualize and process fear, Habilis individuals might have experienced these emotions in a particularly raw and overwhelming way. Modern humans with conditions affecting the prefrontal cortex often report intense, difficult-to-regulate emotional responses. If Habilis had similarly limited prefrontal regulation, their subjective experience of their dangerous world might have been even more terrifying than the objective conditions alone would suggest. This brings us to another aspect of Habilis life that's often overlooked: their sensory experiences. Based on comparative studies with both primates and later human fossils, we can make some educated guesses about how Habilis perceived their world. Their vision was likely excellent, with full color perception and good depth perception, similar to modern humans. This would have been crucial for detecting predators and identifying food sources. Their hearing was probably somewhat different from ours. The auditory bones of early Homo fossils suggest they had good sensitivity to a range of frequencies, but perhaps with different emphasis than modern humans. They might have had particularly acute hearing in ranges useful for detecting predators, such as the low-frequency rumbles of approaching large carnivores or the rustling sounds of stalking cats. Their sense of smell was likely more developed than ours, based on the larger olfactory bulbs inferred from endocasts of their skulls. This would have helped them locate food, identify dangers, and possibly track other individuals in their group. But these acute senses may have been a mixed blessing. Imagine having the sensory capabilities to detect predators all around you, but lacking the cognitive resources to fully process and contextualize these inputs. The result could have been a constant state of hypervigilance and stress. Modern humans experiencing chronic stress show a range of negative health effects, from compromised immune function to cardiovascular problems. While we can't directly measure stress hormones in fossils, it's reasonable to suppose that Habilis individuals suffered similar effects. The constant pressure of predation, competition, and resource scarcity would have activated their stress responses frequently. Without the cognitive resources to regulate these responses effectively, the physiological toll would have been severe. This chronic stress might help explain some of the skeletal pathologies observed in Habilis fossils, such as lines of arrested growth in their teeth and bones. These markers indicate periods of severe physiological stress, often associated with malnutrition or illness. One particularly striking example is the OH13 specimen, whose teeth show multiple lines of arrested growth. This individual experienced at least 4 episodes of severe stress during development, likely representing periods of near starvation or serious illness. The timing of these stress episodes corresponds to seasonal patterns, suggesting that Habilis faced regular annual periods of extreme hardship. This cyclical pattern of feast and famine would have taken a significant toll on their health and longevity. For young Habilis, development would have been particularly challenging. Studies of dental and skeletal maturation suggest that Habilis children grew up faster than modern humans, but slower than great apes, an intermediate pattern consistent with their evolutionary position. This relatively rapid development would have had both advantages and disadvantages. On the positive side, it meant that young Habilis reached physical maturity faster, reducing the period of maximum vulnerability. On the negative side, it meant less time for learning and brain development. Modern humans have an extended childhood precisely because it allows for the development of our complex cognitive abilities and the acquisition of vast amounts of cultural knowledge. Habilis, with their shorter developmental period, would have had less opportunity to learn from older group members. This would have limited the accumulation and transmission of survival knowledge across generations. The fossil record suggests that many Habilis individuals died during or shortly after adolescence, just as they were reaching reproductive age. This pattern indicates that even making it to adulthood was no guarantee of long-term survival. One fascinating specimen, KNM-ER1805, belongs to an adolescent who died at around 13 years of age. This individual shows evidence of having survived a serious illness or period of malnutrition earlier in childhood, only to succumb to what appears to have been a violent death, just as they were approaching maturity. This pattern of individuals surviving multiple hardships only to eventually meet a violent end seems tragically common in the Habilis fossil record. It speaks to both their remarkable resilience and the ultimately overwhelming challenges they faced. For those Habilis who did survive to reproductive age, passing on their genes was far from guaranteed. Female Habilis, with their small body size, would have faced significant risks during pregnancy and childbirth. The Habilis pelvis was transitional between the more ape-like structure of earlier hominins and the birth-adapted form of later humans. This likely made childbirth difficult and dangerous, as the birth canal was relatively narrow compared to the size of a newborn's head. Modern humans have what anthropologists call the obstetrical dilemma, a tight fit between the infant's head and the mother's birth canal that makes childbirth more dangerous than in other primates. Habilis likely experienced a similar challenge, but without the benefit of assistance from cognitively advanced group members. Without midwifery knowledge or the ability to communicate complex instructions, Habilis births would have been significantly more dangerous than those of modern hunter-gatherers. Maternal mortality was likely extremely high, perhaps claiming the lives of as many as 1 in 4 or 5 females. This reproductive risk would have created a serious demographic challenge for Habilis populations, with high mortality across all age groups and significant additional risks for reproductive age females. Maintaining stable population numbers would have been difficult. Mathematical modelling suggests that Habilis populations likely existed at the edge of demographic viability, with group extinction and recolonization being common occurrences. The long-term survival of the species as a whole would have depended on a delicate balance of births and deaths. This demographic precariousness might explain why Habilis remains are relatively rare in the fossil record compared to some other hominin species. Their populations may have been smaller and more scattered, with frequent local extinctions. It might also explain why Habilis appears to have been outcompeted by later Homo species when they emerged. With such a tenuous hold on survival, even a slight competitive disadvantage could have pushed them past the tipping point. The eventual disappearance of Habilis around 1.65 million years ago coincides with the expansion of Homo erectus across Africa. While direct evidence of competition between the two species is limited, the timing strongly suggests that Erectus's advantages in size, brain capacity, and technology proved decisive. What makes the Habilis story particularly poignant is that they represented a crucial transitional stage in human evolution. They were not an evolutionary dead end, but rather a vital link in the chain that eventually led to us. Many of the adaptations that helped Habilis survive, however marginally, became the foundation for the more effective adaptations of later species. Their rudimentary tool use paved the way for the more sophisticated technologies of Erectus and beyond. Their partial dietary shift toward meat consumption, despite its dangers, established a nutritional pattern that would fuel the brain expansion of later Homo species. Their initial steps toward more complex social organization laid groundwork for the highly cooperative societies that would become humanity's greatest adaptive advantage. In this sense, Habilis played a crucial role in human evolution precisely because of the brutal challenges they faced. The extreme selective pressures of their environment weeded out all but the most adaptable individuals, accelerating evolutionary change. It's worth considering what traits might have allowed some Habilis individuals to survive longer than others. Those with slightly larger brains would have had advantages in problem-solving and predator detection. Those with better tool-making abilities could access more nutritious foods. Individuals with more effective social behaviors would benefit from group protection, and those with slightly better communication abilities could warn others of dangers or coordinate activities more effectively. These marginal advantages, which might increase an individual's lifespan from 12 to 15 or 16 years, could make the difference between reproducing and not reproducing. Over many generations, these small survival edges drove the gradual transformation of the human lineage. Another fascinating aspect of Habilis evolution is what geneticists call genetic bottlenecks. These occur when a population is drastically reduced in number, leaving only a small group of survivors to pass on their genes to future generations. While we can't directly analyze Habilis DNA, comparative studies of modern human and ape genomes suggest that early Homo species likely experienced several severe bottlenecks. These would have occurred during periods of extreme climate change or particularly intense competition. During such events, population numbers might have dropped to just a few thousand individuals across the entire species. In local areas, entire Habilis populations might have been wiped out, with only a few groups surviving in refuge areas. These bottlenecks would have had profound effects on Habilis genetics, potentially eliminating some valuable adaptations while concentrating others. They might explain why Habilis anatomy shows such variable patterns, with some individuals appearing more advanced than others. The variability in Habilis fossils has led some researchers to suggest that we might actually be looking at more than one species. Some specimens show more primitive features, while others appear more advanced and closer to later Homo species. This variation might represent geographical differences, with populations in different regions facing different selective pressures, or it might represent temporal changes, with Habilis gradually evolving over their half-million-year existence. Either way, this variability highlights another challenge Habilis faced. They were a species in transition, caught between the more arboreal lifestyle of earlier hominins and the more terrestrial adaptation of later humans. This evolutionary in-betweenness likely contributed to their vulnerability. They weren't fully adapted for either niche, making them less efficient than both their predecessors and their descendants. Evolutionary biologists call this the jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none problem, and it can create significant survival challenges. we see a similar pattern in their geographic distribution. Habilis appears to have been restricted to East and possibly South Africa, unlike later species like Erectus that spread across Africa and into Asia. This limited range made them vulnerable to regional climate fluctuations. When conditions deteriorated in East Africa, Habilis had nowhere else to go. Later species, with their wider distributions, could weather regional catastrophes because populations elsewhere would survive and eventually recolonize. The Habilis way of life eventually came to an end around 1.65 million years ago. Their disappearance coincides with a period of increased aridity in East Africa and the expansion of more open grassland environments. These conditions would have further disadvantaged Habilis while favouring the adaptations of Erectus, with its longer legs better suited for covering ground efficiently in open terrain. The taller Erectus would also have had advantages in spotting predators and prey at a distance in these environments. The final days of Habilis as a species likely involved increasingly fragmented populations clinging to shrinking forested areas near permanent water sources. Competition with Erectus and other hominins would have intensified as these refuge areas became more crowded. As their numbers dwindled, genetic diversity would have decreased, making them less adaptable to continuing environmental changes. Eventually, the last Habilis groups would have faded away, outcompeted by their more advanced relatives. Yet, in an important sense, Habilis lives on in us. Many of the genes that helped them survive their brutal world have been passed down through the human lineage. Some of our most distinctively human traits have their origins in adaptations that first emerged in Habilis. Our manual dexterity, which allows us to create everything from stone tools to smartphones, builds on the hand structure that evolved in Habilis for basic tool use. Our omnivorous diet, combining plant and animal foods, follows a pattern established by Habilis. Even our social nature, which manifests in complex societies and global civilizations, has roots in the group living that helped Habilis survive predation. In a very real sense, their struggle is our heritage. Modern genetic studies suggest that some traits that helped early humans survive extreme conditions may actually create challenges in our modern environment. Genes that promoted fat storage, for instance, were highly adaptive for hunter-gatherers facing frequent food shortages. Those same genes may contribute to obesity and related health problems in today's world of food abundance. Similarly, stress responses that helped our ancestors react quickly to predator threats may underlie anxiety disorders in our comparatively safe modern world. This suggests that we're still living with the genetic legacy of our ancestors' struggles, including those of Habilis. The worst time to be human has left its mark on what it means to be human today. Another fascinating connection between Habilis and modern humans involves brain development. The Habilis brain showed the beginnings of a symmetry between the left and right hemispheres, a pattern that becomes more pronounced in later human species. This asymmetry is associated with specialized functions, including language processing, which is typically concentrated in the left hemisphere in modern humans. The rudimentary asymmetry in Habilis brains suggests they may have had the beginnings of some language-like communication. This early communication ability, while far simpler than modern language, would have provided crucial survival advantages. Even basic warnings about predators or information about food sources could have made the difference between life and death. Modern neuroscience suggests that language and tool-making are connected in the brain with overlapping neural networks. The simple stone tools made by Habilis may have both reflected and stimulated cognitive developments that eventually led to human language. If this is true, then every time we speak, write, or read, we're building on cognitive foundations that were first laid down under the brutal selective pressures faced by Habilis. Our most human ability emerged from their desperate struggle to survive. Recent anthropological research has increasingly emphasized the importance of cooperation in human evolution. While traditional views focused on competition, we now recognize that collaborative behaviors played a crucial role in our ancestors' survival. Evidence from Habilis sites suggests that they too engaged in some cooperative activities. Stone tools and butchered animal bones are often found clustered in specific locations, suggesting that individuals brought resources back to a shared space. This pattern differs from what we see in great apes, where food sharing is limited. It suggests that even at this early stage, our ancestors were beginning to develop the cooperative behaviors that would become humanity's signature adaptation. The development of cooperation would have been especially valuable for a species as physically vulnerable as Habilis. Lacking the strength of great apes or the speed of many predators, they would have relied on group vigilance and collective defense. This early cooperation likely had limits, however. Without complex language, Habilis would have struggled to coordinate sophisticated collective actions. Their cooperation was probably based on simpler mechanisms like emotional contagion and behavioral mimicry. These basic forms of cooperation would have been particularly important for child rearing. Habilis infants, like modern human babies, were likely born in a relatively underdeveloped state compared to other primates. This pattern, known as secondary altriciality, means that infants require extensive care for an extended period. In modern humans, this care typically involves multiple individuals beyond the mother, including fathers, older siblings, and grandparents. If Habilis followed a similar pattern, it would have required some level of cooperative childcare within groups. This arrangement would have had both advantages and challenges for a species with limited cognitive resources. On the positive side, shared childcare would have allowed mothers to forage more efficiently. On the negative side, coordinating care without complex communication would have been difficult and potentially dangerous for infants. The fossil record suggests that infant mortality was extremely high in Habilis, with perhaps as many as 50 to 60% of children dying before reaching 5 years of age. This rate far exceeds what we see in modern hunter-gatherer societies or even in other primates. Such high mortality would have created intense selective pressure for any traits that improved infant survival, potentially including behaviours related to cooperative care. It might also have shaped emotional attachments between group members. Modern humans are unique among primates in the intensity and complexity of our emotional bonds. We form deep attachments not just to immediate family members, but to extended kin and even unrelated individuals within our social groups. These emotional connections facilitate the cooperation that has been key to human survival. It's intriguing to consider that these distinctively human emotional patterns might have begun to emerge in Habilis as adaptations to their brutally challenging environment. If so, then our capacity for love, friendship, and group loyalty might ironically have roots in the most brutally challenging period of human existence. Our highest emotional capabilities emerged from our lowest survival circumstances. Another aspect of Habilis life that left a lasting legacy was their relationship with technology. They were the first creatures on Earth to systematically modify objects to create tools, a behavior that would become the defining characteristic of the human lineage. While their older tools seem primitive by later standards, they represented an enormous cognitive leap. The ability to envision how a rock could be transformed into a cutting tool requires abstract thinking and planning that exceeds what we see in even the most intelligent non-human animals. This cognitive breakthrough set Habilis on a trajectory that eventually led to all human technology, from stone axes to space stations. In this sense, the smartphone in your pocket has its origins in the simple stone tools Habilis used to scrape meat from scavenged carcasses. What's particularly remarkable is that this technological innovation emerged under such challenging circumstances. Habilis didn't develop tools in a context of leisure or security, but rather in a desperate struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. This pattern of innovation under extreme pressure would characterize much of subsequent human evolution. Many of our most significant technological and social advances came during periods of crisis when existing strategies proved inadequate. Even today, human ingenuity often shines brightest in the face of challenges. From developing vaccines during pandemics to creating water purification systems for drought-stricken regions, we continue to innovate most dramatically when survival is at stake. This connection between adversity and innovation suggests that the brutal conditions faced by Habilis, while unimaginably difficult, may have been necessary for sparking the cognitive revolution that eventually produced modern humanity. Without the extreme selective pressures of their harsh environment, Habilis might have remained more like earlier hominins, comfortable in their ecological niche but never driven to develop the adaptations that would transform the planet. From this perspective, the worst time to be a human might also have been the most important time for becoming human. The very brutality of Habilis' existence catalyzed changes that would eventually make life better for all their descendants. This isn't to romanticize their suffering or suggest that extreme hardship is necessary for progress. The Habilis experience was genuinely tragic on an individual level, with countless lives cut brutally short by predation, starvation, disease, and conflict. Rather, it's to recognize that our existence today, with all its comfort and security, was purchased at an enormous cost by countless generations of ancestors who struggled and mostly failed to survive in much harsher conditions. We modern humans, with our medicine, technology, and social systems, enjoy lifespans 6 times longer than Habilis on average. We rarely fear predation. Most of us have reliable access to food and shelter. We live in a world that would seem miraculous to our ancient ancestors. This remarkable transformation occurred through an unbroken chain of genetic and cultural inheritance stretching back millions of years. Every human innovation, from fire to agriculture to writing to digital technology, built on what came before. And at the beginning of this chain were creatures like Habilis, small-bodied and small-brained by our standards, struggling against overwhelming odds with only the simplest of tools and social structures to help them. Their lives were brutally short and undeniably harsh. The evidence suggests they experienced levels of predation, injury, malnutrition, and mortality that exceed anything known in recorded human history. When we compare the approximate 12-year average lifespan of Habilis to the 70-plus years enjoyed by people in many modern societies, we're looking at the most dramatic quality of life improvement in human history. This extraordinary transformation wasn't primarily driven by changes in our physical environment. Africa today still has many of the same predators that terrorized Habilis. Droughts and food shortages still occur. Disease-causing organisms still evolve to exploit human hosts. What changed was our capacity to modify our environment and create buffers against its hazards. Through incremental advances in technology, social organization, and knowledge accumulation, we transformed the human condition. Each generation built on the achievements of those who came before, gradually constructing a world where predation is rare, food is abundant, disease is often treatable, and lifespan is extended far beyond what our ancestors could have imagined. This process wasn't always smooth or linear. There were setbacks and periods where conditions actually worsened, as during the transition to agriculture or the Industrial Revolution. But the long-term trend has been toward increasing security and longevity. From this perspective, the story of human evolution is ultimately one of hope. Beginning from perhaps the worst possible starting conditions, our lineage managed to overcome extraordinary challenges through cooperation, innovation, and persistence. The fact that Habilis survived at all, given the array of formidable predators and environmental challenges they faced, speaks to a remarkable resilience that we've inherited. That same resilience has helped humans overcome countless challenges throughout our evolutionary history. So while Habilis undoubtedly experienced the worst time to be human, they also inaugurated the long, slow process that would eventually create the best time to be human. Their struggle was the necessary first step in an extraordinary journey.